Right, well, hi everyone. A very warm welcome to you all. My name is Dennis Grube and I'm a Professor of Public Policy here in Cambridge, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's Annual Public Policy Lecture. The Annual Public Policy Lecture is an initiative of the Department of Politics and International Studies and the Bennett Institute for Public Policy, with the goal of discussing the really big issues that are confronting policymakers in the 21st century. And that's certainly what we're going to be talking about tonight. Now, of course, this year's speaker for the Annual Public Policy Lecture is the wonderful Neil Lawrence. Neil is the inaugural DeepMind Professor of Machine Learning here at the University of Cambridge. He is also Senior AI Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute and Visiting Professor of Machine Learning at the University of Sheffield. Neil has spent more than 2 decades grappling with machine learning and indeed spent 3 years as Director of Machine Learning at Amazon. As his latest book, The Atomic Human, confirms, Neil examines technology not for its own sake, but for its capacity to make the lives of people better. I hope that's still true, Neil. Look, Neil's friends and admirers are everywhere, but can I especially acknowledge one of his close collaborators tonight, Jessica Montgomery, who is the Director of AI at CAM and will join us for the Q&A after the lecture. Now, look, one of the joys of a place like Cambridge is that you get to sort of rub shoulders with extraordinary people just as part of everyday life. And I normally see Neil when I'm walking out and about in the city of Cambridge, and Neil may not remember this, but the last time I saw him was along the backs of the colleges here in summer, and I accosted him and I asked him why we do not yet have an AI-controlled aerial taxi to take me around Cambridge. I don't think that's the kind of supply and demand gap that Neil is intending to talk about tonight, but I'm looking forward to find out. So please join me in welcoming him to the podium to give the Annual Public Policy Lecture, Neil Lawrence.
Thanks, Dennis. Just to check, when do you want me to target for questions starting? When should I target for questions to start? 9 o'clock? Okay. Okay, perfect. And thank you so much for that introduction, Dennis, and for the invite to the Bennett Institute. It really is a great privilege to be here this evening. And talking about an area that I have been involved with as a sort of attempt to use policy or to inform policy, but I'm not an expert on. So I'm looking forward to a lot of my policy understanding comes from my colleague Jess Montgomery, who led the Royal Society's work on machine learning back in 2015, 16, 17. And has informed a great deal of the work that we've done ever since. We've been working together for nearly 10 years. Okay, so what I thought I'd do is start with the analogy. This is the Joseph Wright painting titled The Alchemist. And the idea, I think his name's Hennig Berg, who discovered phosphorus. And this is a painting of him discovering phosphorus. But what the alchemist was actually searching for, this is 1771, was the Philosopher's Stone. So famous from Harry Potter movies, but also formerly, before Harry Potter, famous as the material that converts base metal into gold. I don't know if it's famously, but certainly famously to me, Isaac Newton spent quite a lot of his early career studying alchemy, searching for the Philosopher's Stone, and later became master of the Royal Mint. And this is interesting. I think at the time he became master of the Royal Mint, he became very wealthy because they found a lot of gold across that period, but actually it was a silver standard. at the time. And if he had invented an alchemic way to convert base metals to gold, it's sort of interesting to think about what that would have triggered, which would have just been massive inflation. It would have just devalued gold. Because if you could convert all the lead you have to gold, then actually gold as a material is less useful than lead. So you just end up with gold not being worth very much. And so what's that got to do with us? Well, this is an important quote from the modern era of what we might think of as the attention economy. So it's Herbert Simon, who won the Nobel Memorial Prize in economics, but actually is considered, I mean, he was a multidisciplinary individual and is considered a very early computer scientist. And he's talking about a world where information becomes very common. People were thinking about this in the 1970s. And he's talking about the consequences. And this quote, it was a part of a quote that is sort of very important in understanding the world we're in at the moment. What information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. And what does that mean? Well, it means that fast forward 52, 53 years, and we're in an economy where the scarce resource is human attention, not information. Information is available by the bucket load. Human attention is the difficult thing to find. Human attention is the equivalent of the gold in the attention economy. So what's the philosopher's stone? Well, the philosopher's stone is automation, AI, converting base metal, steel and steam into human manual labor, or converting silicon and electrons into human mental labor. And we're facing a world where we face inflation in these capabilities, inflation in human attention. If we have people who formerly were trained in manufacturing and then we replace them with robots, we reduce the value of their human capabilities. If we have people who are trained to convert plain English into complex legal sounding documents, and then we can manage to do that with large language models, we're triggering inflation in that ability. So this, to me, is an early example of when these processes started happening. So this is a form of philosopher's stone. It's the Chicago stone, which is 2600 BC. And what it records is the sale of a number of fields. So it's from Mesopotamia. We're talking about 1800 years, let's say 1200 years before Homer, and already a civilization that has nearly 1,000 years of written history. But as my colleague John Tenney, who's an Assyriologist here in Cambridge, says to me, writing was invented not by poets, but by accountants. And it was invented for the process of managing the economy of growing cities that had irrigated the desert and were growing grain at scale and needed to manage supply chains to bring wood in because there wasn't wood available where these cities were. The information stored on this is the recording of a sale of fields, but when we worked with John, we looked at legal documents. John's told us about civil administration documents. He spends his time as an Assyriologist unpicking the economy of the ancient city of Nippur from about 1500 to 1000 BC. Now, the people who controlled access to these forms of information, the scribes, became very powerful. In some societies, they even became the priesthood. In other societies, they became a set of professional administrators. And broadly speaking, if you look across history, one of the things they did consistently is work to ensure that they were the ones that were controlling access to information, because that's how they became powerful and wealthy. But over time, this group of people also gained responsibilities, whether through the priesthood or standards of behavior within their profession. And today, we have the professions, the descendants of the scribes, the lawyers, the accountants, the civil administrators, who don't just have power, but they have responsibility alongside that power. They have responsibility towards society through their institutions. They form a fundamental part of democratic institutionalism, the pieces of democracy that aren't about direct voting, they're about standards of behavior and competent people who balance their personal interests with those of the wider population. I came across this book while Jess was convening the working group for the Royal Society. I think probably it was published around 2015. This book said that the future, the next wave of automation in machine learning, is going to transform the future of professions. And at the time, that sounded plausible, but I couldn't quite imagine how true that would become with the latest generation of generative AI. This generation is affecting human attention in a space that people thought was preserved, the human attention of the people who are translating legal documents, who are writing legal reports. These areas that people thought were protected are now being subject to these changes. So what does this mean for the UK? Well, I was at a Future of Europe meeting convened in Mallorca, in some nice finca, which was a very nice place, but in many regards very depressing, because there weren't many things in which people talked about Europe being leading or Europe having a great future. But there was one thing that was mentioned, which was human capital. So after I came back, I looked up the World Bank's Human Capital Index and found, I think, the UK ranks 11th. So we're behind some people, but very interestingly, we're ahead of the USA and China. So what is human capital? Well, it's a mix of the measure of the health and education of our population. So in some sense, it's a measure of human potential. Of course, it's not a measure of what those people are trained to do. So they are educated people, but what have they been educated in? So the question that occurs to me, and is the center of this talk, and is not the question in my book, The Atomic Human, but it's another way of looking at the same concept, is what is the piece of human capital, the unique kernel, that is not subject to the alchemist's inflation? What are the skills in our human capital capabilities that won't be replaced, that aren't the same as the car parts manufacturer who used to pop the rivets, that aren't the same as the lawyer who's translating an English statement into more legal formal language, that aren't the same as what a translator might do to translate English into high quality German or French? What are those roles? Well, as we take each one of those jobs, we can look at how they will be absorbed by the wider ecosystem. Because when we look at how technical innovation traditionally affects productivity, we come across the productivity flywheel. And this is the notion that as we develop technologies, R&D investment enables technical innovation that enables productivity gains, that generates an economic surplus that then funds R&D investment, and this wheel goes round and round and round. So if you find any technical innovation, any R&D investment that can be subject to this wheel, you can expect that over time, those capabilities are going to be sliced away from the human. And what are those things? What are those things in practice? Well, the challenge is that this strength in human capital is a double-edged sword. Because as this automation creates efficiency, it risks rendering the skills we have in our stored human capital redundant. So we need to understand those capabilities that are inflation resistant. And this is where I see this core, this notion I think of as the atomic human, the capabilities that are unique to human, that cannot be absorbed simply by the machine, that will be inflation-proof in this way, because the philosopher's stone of automation will never replace them. Now, you can ask the question, does such a thing exist? Well, my argument is it does, but we don't have to say what it is to follow what I'm saying here, because the core next piece is, if there's a reducible core, what properties does it have? Now, when it comes to the irreducible core, these are the properties I think it has. Machines rely on measurable outputs, quantified aspects of human behavior are easier to automate. When it comes to my community, machine learning, the thing that I've been doing for more than 25 years, anything that we can quantify in terms of what a human is doing is something that we can get an angle on to try and automate. But that implies something. That implies that the essential aspects of humanity may be the hardest to measure. So this is leading to what I would call an uncertainty principle. It's borrowed from physics, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, but it's slightly different here. The uncertainty principle may be the following. As you start to approach that irreducible core of the atomic human, as you get closer and closer to that inflation-proof piece, your ability to measure it becomes harder and harder. And that's the policy challenge we now face. Because for any country that is either trying to develop its human capital, whether you feel you've got the store of that or not, or it's trying to maintain its human capital, what I think we're seeing is that the classic approach we see in the productivity flywheel is going to fail. That classic approach is going to fail because the productivity gains are typically measured productivity gains. They're typically translated into monetary value. The economic surplus is typically funds. And those funds have to be redistributed to the areas that can be measured as being needy. But when you can't measure what that surplus is, how do you redistribute? That's the question I'm going to try and answer this evening. So this uncertainty principle leaves us with a problem. But we can start saying something about the atomic human. The atomic human doesn't sit in the percentage of A grades we're getting in A-level results. That's very measurable. And indeed, we can already train these machines to pass exams. And I'm sure we'll be able to train them to pass exams far better than we can pass exams. It doesn't necessarily mean that you would then trust them to become a doctor or a lawyer. It's also not in the length of our hospital waiting lists, another measure we might use to try and quantify what's going in the hospitals. It's in the quality of human interaction. It's in the nurse spending an extra 5 minutes with a patient to ensure that they're comfortable. It's with the teacher who sees the child is distressed and spends an extra 10 minutes talking them to find out what's wrong and listen to their challenges. It's in the bus driver who pauses to let the elderly person cross the road in front of them. It's not in the time the bus driver takes to complete their route. This is the form of human capital that in the end will always be there. This is leading to a new productivity paradox. So the current productivity flywheel relies on the measurement, but as we get closer to the atomic human, that measurement becomes harder or potentially impossible to conduct. What does this mean in practice? Well, one of the things I really remember about that Royal Society piece of work is we were convened in the Royal Society, a number of MPs, a number of academics, a number of senior policy professionals. And we were convened approximately a week after the Brexit vote. And one of the MPs said, well, I bet no one in this room voted for Brexit. And I thought, oh, well, isn't that just the problem? Because the people who voted for Brexit were the previous wave of people whose human capital had been subject to inflation, who had been told that they should spend their careers down a mine or in a steelworks, and then were later told that this had become economically redundant because it was being done more efficiently elsewhere. That book by Daniel and Richard Susskind had been a key motivator for some of our thinking in that report. But one of the things that this question made me realize is that, yes, the professionals are potentially most exposed to this latest wave of innovation, but simultaneously, they are the most capable of handling it because they're highly educated. So if we go back in history, and I think the question that occurred to me when I was chairing a later meeting and people were talking about this is, what happened to stockbrokers after algorithmic trading came along? Were they destitute on the streets, or did they adapt and take other jobs? And I was fortunate that we had people from that banking industry and said, well, they moved on and did other things. They had the capability to retrain, understand what to do next. They had the wealth and time to learn new jobs, and they weren't disrupted in the way that people who were industrial communities, coal mining communities were disrupted. So this leads to this notion I think of as the coin pusher model, that the people who are affected by such disruption are those that are already on the edge of society. It's not the people where the coins are falling down to trigger the disruption. It's those that are already on the edge, and a small amount of disruption indirectly takes them down. Those are the people who struggle under innovative disruption. So what's going on? The thing that I think is that we are not solving those people's problems. And broadly speaking, I think there is a gap between the innovation supply and the innovation demand. After this meeting, Future of Europe, they allowed us to stay in this very nice hotel. And I was sat by the pool the next day thinking what the right way of capturing this gap is. And I'm not an expert in this. There are people in the room who are more expert. But it felt to me that a good way of describing this is that there's an overemphasis on the macroeconomic supply of innovation and an underemphasis on the microeconomic demand of where people would like these innovations to be improving their lives. And I'll show some evidence for that in a minute. But let me also show what happens when people introduce these technologies. Digital failure examples. The Horizon scandal. So my favorite thing about this image, and Jess's least favorite thing about this image, is it includes Jess Montgomery, who's actually the clerk sat next to the chair in the 2015 inquiry. Well, sorry, it's not an inquiry, it's a parliamentary committee that was dramatized recently. Now, what's fascinating about the Horizon scandal is it doesn't involve AI. The Horizon system was commissioned by the Blair government in the late 1990s, and the errors that were made in its deployment were made at that point when it was being commissioned, because the idea was that they were going to commission a system that would make the distribution of at the initial outset. It was going to handle social care payments as well as the accounts of the post offices. It was going to centralize these. It was going to be a remarkable system that took away from the post office sub-postmasters the responsibility for maintaining their accounts, put that into a computer system. Well, I say responsibility, the action for maintaining the accounts, it actually left the responsibility for the accounts with the sub-postmasters themselves. But unfortunately, it was misimplemented. We're in a situation now where the information economy has moved away from stone tablets through books into digital systems. And the people who are responsible for protecting the sub-postmasters, people such as lawyers, accountants, and civil administrators who are all sat around this table, have been fundamentally disempowered by the digital technology that has been deployed because they can no longer check the books. You could only check the books by going through Fujitsu. And Fujitsu were not incentivized to allow people to understand how their system was failing. And so we had to wait 15 years for this inquiry and nearly 20 years before compensation is paid to people who were given responsibility for accounting systems that they didn't control, and the responsibility and the people who actually controlled those could not be held accountable. Potentially a more interesting and bigger scandal would have been if the National Programme for IT and the NHS's equivalent system that was going to manage our electronic health records had been allowed to deploy. The Lorenzo system was cancelled at a cost of £11 billion, which was seen as a national scandal 13 years ago. But I've watched some of the evidence for this, and you think, well, if only they'd cancelled the Horizon Post Office system, we would be in a better place. It was right that they cancelled it, because the system was being badly designed and badly implemented. And as you look through, this is the Public Accounts Office Jess doesn't appear in this picture. Public accounts, national accounts, I'm getting the names wrong, but it's the accounts office that's doing this inquiry, speaking to the people who are responsible, CSC and BT, and finding out what went wrong. And it's just abysmal deployment of information systems, tracing from the same type of errors that we see in the Horizon scandal. And the commonalities is basically a policy reality disconnect. In both cases, they didn't talk to people on the ground, they didn't listen to the problems that they were surfacing, they just assumed they could be fixed centrally. There were poor understanding of local needs, whether that was hospital needs or whether that was a sub-postmaster's need. There were missing feedback loops to pass the problems back. So as the deployments were occurring, people tried to fix them centrally, but they didn't understand the nature of the problems because they weren't actually familiar with the roles of those who were at the coalface. And this is the scandal of digital technology, that even up till now, it's deployed in such a way that disempowers some of the most important people in our society, what Popper calls piecemeal social engineers, those who are responsible for ensuring that the aspects of democracy that we depend upon, like rule of law and protection of the individual, are held in place. So the implementation issues are all about an inflexible top-down approach, limited stakeholder input, and inadequate technical oversight. And there's some key lessons we can take from this, though, none of which you hear being spoken about at the moment, and that is a national scandal. That in order to deploy these digital systems, you have to engage stakeholders at all levels, design flexible systems, and include feedback mechanisms, or else you are lining yourself up for the same type of failure that we've seen with these large-scale IT deployments. Phased rollouts, ensure technical competence, set realistic timelines. But let's step back from that and ask the deeper question. Because another aspect of these systems is actually people didn't really ask for them. They asked for a different set of things. These systems were solutions to what people thought that people were asking for. But one of the challenges we face is if you go out to the general population, they have particular problems that they'll talk about that aren't being met by the innovations we're deploying because we attempt to deploy a one-size-fits-all solution. So what do people want? Well, this is the work that goes back for 2015, work between the Royal Society and Ipsos Mori, where Jess led the work on behalf of the Royal Society. I was on the working group. Public views of machine learning, reporting in April 2017, but I think the views are sort of taken across 2016 as well. What's absolutely fascinating when we ask about machine learning, and of course that's the same technology underpinning AI, but it was an era before it had gained such public prominence, is how sensible their answers are. You can ask about applications in health, social care, marketing. They talk about their desires. Participants could see applications in health was the greatest potential benefit for individuals and society. They felt it would improve accuracy as machines would be considered more data when making diagnoses than humans. However, they stressed the need for human doctors to remain involved to ensure personal contact continues where it's needed. Another example I like is education. Some participants were concerned that tailored education based on machine learning would result in de-skilling and limiting people to certain career paths at too young an age. However, the majority felt that tailored learning was a positive. They saw the potential of machine learning to spot patterns in attainment, attendance, and general attitude, to flag any issues for teachers to address. Notice the teacher is still included. The one area where unequivocally, and we covered crime, we covered controversial, we covered marketing, but the one area where the public unequivocally said no was art. Participants failed to see the purpose of machine learning written poetry. For all other case studies, participants recognized that a machine might be able to do a better job than a human. However, they did not think this would be the case when creating art, as doing so was considered to be a fundamentally human activity that machines could only mimic at best. And what is the one area we have made undoubted progress in since 2015 with our AI technologies? Well, you can ask ChatGPT to write a soliloquy that introduces large language models as spoken by Mercutio. And this was a year and a half ago. It would even be better now. It's certainly better a job than I would be able to do. There may be, this is Cambridge, so there may be people who have a depth of understanding of large language models and a depth of understanding of Shakespeare and are talented enough to construct such a poem, but it's pretty impressive. But is it creative? Does it build on the core of the atomic human? Is it the thing that anyone asked for? No. And why is that? Because fundamentally, the productivity flywheel is not delivering the solutions people asked for. It's delivering solutions for problems people didn't know they had. Because that's how you make money. You don't make money by trying to attack the most difficult problems society has, the so-called wicked problems that society has always had. We repeated a version of this work under the AI at Cannes banner across September, and we have a report that we published, I think, just last month, just a few weeks ago. Public dialogue on AI and public services. So we based our dialogue around the Labour government's new missions. And what we found in a dialogue in Liverpool alongside the Labour conference and a dialogue in Cambridge was basically the same answer. So these are some quotes from participants. I think a lot of the ideas need to be about AI being like a co-pilot to someone. I think it has to be that, so not taking the human away. We also saw that reflected 9 years ago in the Royal Society work. In healthcare, key aspirations included reducing administrative burden on clinicians, supporting early diagnosis and prevention, improving research and drug development, better management of complex conditions. That, to me, is already a more impressive list of wants than a lot of the policy documents we're seeing in the AI space. And it's coming from regular members of the public. Here's a quote. My wife, an NHS nurse, says the paperwork side takes longer than the actual care. I wouldn't want to rely just on the technology for something big like that, because obviously it's a life-changing situation. This is in response to a health decision. Now, whatever the accuracy of these systems, certainly the situation at the moment is most people feel that they would like a human involved in a significant decision like that. And that's actually reflected in our law. The GDPR already says that for consequential decisions, we need human involvement. Education. There was a lot of support for reducing teacher workload, and there was concern about screen times and support for more interaction between humans at school. Education isn't just about learning, it's about preparing children for life, and you don't do all that in front of a screen. Kids with ADHD or autism might prefer to interact with an iPad than they would in person. It would lighten the load for them. So people are also thinking about people outside. They see a diversity of possibilities. They have a deep understanding of what the issues are, and they're rarely asked what they'd like to see. And when they are asked, we fail to deliver it. So the dialogue summary from the recent dialogue is basically enhance, don't replace humans. They wanted to see strong governance coming first. And they wanted a fair distribution of the benefits of the technologies. And they wanted services to be human-centered. We need to look at the causes. We need to do some more thinking and not just start using AI to plaster over them being societal issues. But what do we see in the policy debate? We see think tanks telling us that large-scale deployment of AI will plaster over all the societal issues. We don't see a sophisticated understanding of what those issues are, how we'll need to address them, and how we'll need to take a multi-stakeholder approaches, even though those are laid out in the previous waves of digitization where things went wrong. So what's the solution? Well, I'm going to start with a broad picture that we use across a number of areas when we're thinking about Cambridge, the country, what the role of innovation is. And this is what we call the supply chain of ideas. And this is to try and lift people out of what their role is. I had a colleague called Narayan when I was at Amazon, and he was a supply chain expert. And he lived in Bombay, but his family was a long time ago from the South. And he used to tell this story about someone who was in Kerala, who used to sell coconuts by the side of the river. So Kerala is where they filmed Apocalypse Now, for those of you who know the movie, and tourists go along those rivers And you can sell them coconuts, apparently. And Narayan used to say that this individual used to sell coconuts, and then when he'd run out, he would climb the tree and pick another coconut, and pick more coconuts, sell those. And when that tree had run out, he would move down the bank and sit under a different tree. And then Narayan would say, this guy has the shortest supply chain in the world. And then he would say, the magic of supply chain is making everyone think everything grows on a coconut tree. Now let's think about that with ideas. Do our ideas grow on a coconut tree? When someone comes to us with a policy problem, do we just reach up and take out the last thing that we selected from our most recent paper? Yes, we do. But what should we be doing? Whether it's us or someone else, there should be the management of the supply chain of ideas. We should be directing the problem to the place where the solution exists. And this process should be the role of national institutes, not we're going to invent the solutions here, we're going to employ the best researchers. We know that doesn't work. The chances that you employed the one researcher who is best qualified to answer that question are virtually nil. But the chances that that researcher exists within the UK or exists within the wider world are very high. And if they don't, your role becomes supply stimulation. You start redistributing grant funding. You set challenges. You encourage people to think about the questions that are being asked on the policy side or within the innovation economy side. So this is key. We are not stimulating people correctly to think about the right set of problems. When we stimulate, we're just putting more money into the venture capital ecosystem or giving more support to big tech companies. And these groups have already shown they can't solve these difficult problems. Whatever they do, which is brilliant, however economically powerful they are, however impressive they are, they have consistently failed to resolve wicked problems. Problems in health, social care, and education. Why? Because you don't make a lot of money in those areas. So, we need to focus on understanding our current stock of ideas. This is one reason we've started looking at meta-science, or the science of science, trying to support UKRI in understanding where those ideas, and do active management of idea resources. But that's not the complete solution. And today I managed to sneak in an op-ed to the Financial Times just for this lecture, to give my best compressed version of how we do that. Because it's all very well to say that's the philosophy, but you need to be taking actions that are effective in practice. And this is what I think. This is my best ability, this is my best summary of the work that I've seen others doing successfully, that we're trying to do here, that is going to deliver, I believe, the type of innovation we need, which is to look at a new form of flywheel, what I think of as an attention flywheel. One that realizes that translating human attention into money is always going to fail as you get closer to the atomic human. So how do you resolve that? Well, you have to reinvest the time you save by supporting those at the coalface within the ecosystem. So fundamentally, the flywheel goes like this. You have human capital. It enables real-world innovation. You work with people to say, how can we make your paperwork load reduce? How can we make it easier for you to go through this planning application? How can we make it easier for you to see 14 patients a week rather than the 5 you're seeing because of the paperwork write-ups? You listen to what their problem is, and very often the solution is not something that is going to make the cover of Nature magazine. It's often something very simple, but people just need support in understanding and implementing that. You support that person in understanding the implementation, which leads to efficiency gains in their time and their attention. Those people come back to you and they are grateful. And you say, could you now help other people by explaining how this works? We need you to feed your time back into the ecosystem because we're not going to get a large grant and a large training scheme to teach everyone how to fix this. And even if we were, we don't have people who understand your role and how to do it properly. We need you to take your enthusiasm for what you have achieved and feed it back into the ecosystem directly by spending time convening meetings, sharing these solutions with experts in your domain, leading to more quality attention, allowing us to develop the human capital and running a flywheel that scales exponentially across disciplines, as long as we understand that spirit of we're trying to sort people for their problems, not imposing technical solutions upon them. So that's my best description. But does it work? Well, here's my first example. Data Science Africa is a bottom-up initiative for capacity building in data science, machine learning, and AI on the African continent. It started in 2015. And today, I would claim it has some of the most capable data scientists I've seen, because these people go from the farmer's field to the Ministry of Agriculture. They go from health centers to the Ministry of Health with solutions that take into account local needs, both from the farmer and from the minister. Because, of course, in the African ecosystem, there is less established infrastructure, less established professional infrastructure. So it's easier to. It's your only option to actually go right the way across the ecosystem. So that started out as one small workshop with about 50 people at it, and this is out of date now. I missed last year's meeting, but it's now a Pan-African group with sort of hundreds and thousands of people involved, local chapters forming, this style of approach just scaling. One of the key components is that they are very careful not to take too much funding and become reliant on large grants because it undermines their sustainability. When they do get funding, they reinvest it in the ecosystem. They reinvest it in by handing out grants, supporting the establishment of new groups, allowing people from countries who've not been engaged before to fly into the meetings. It's very expensive in Africa to fly from one African country to another because the hubs are all in Europe or the Qatar or Dubai. So they're reinvesting all their money in the ecosystem where it comes, not creating large administrative infrastructures that mean that they become dependent on funding sources just to continue with what they're doing. If you cut their funding now, they would be upset, but they would just continue to do what they're doing. I wrote about this 9 years ago. And at the time, that was the sparsely introduced auditorium. And I didn't deliver that. I just shared some ideas about how to organize meetings. They delivered everything on their own. There's no way I would possibly have time to do that. So what's the Cambridge approach? Well, to the extent that we can, my influence, and of course there's many other people involved in AI at CAM, including steering committee others, has been to try and drive us in that direction. The attention flywheel is only something I came out with, I think across the last few months in trying to respond to what is the way of describing what we're doing to politicians and why it works. But I do think it's correct, and I think it's reflected in our activities. So when you look at the sort of activities we're doing in Cambridge to address this, we have our AIdeas program, which is across 20 departments, 5 projects. We're just about to award, I don't know how many I can say, we're going to award as many more as we can. But these projects are focused on what we think of as academic unicorns, interdisciplinary projects involving technical capability and domain expertise in areas as diverse as mental health support, local decision-making, language support, women's fertility and infant health, and climate and nature and policy making in climate and nature. The Policy Lab, which we actively work on in collaboration, and notice everything is in collaboration. We are not trying to own these spaces. There are extraordinary people here in Cambridge already who lead in these areas, but we just try and join things up. With Bennett and Menderu, trying to inform government with our best understanding of what's going on the ecosystem. The public dialogue work I spoke about, that was with Kavli. HPC pioneer projects with research computing services, working with them to help them understand what the new type of customer of high-performance computers, someone from the humanities, not someone who's just trying to do climate or the materials, working with Research Computing Services and the Cambridge Centre for Data-Driven C2D3. The Accelerate program, which is about AI for science and trying to improve scientists' capabilities to deploy AI. Each one of these has at its heart an attention flywheel, building people's capabilities, encouraging them to share, convening the right types of groups, and looking to expand. So what are we doing to solve this problem? Well, what you can see we're doing is we're interacting directly with the micro demand, not the macro supply. And we're releasing quality attention by doing that, improving the efficiency. And these new technologies, even though they weren't asked for, they have an extraordinary possibility. For the first time, anyone in this room can talk or write to a computer in plain English or German or French and have the computer do something that they want. It is no longer the situation that the accountants and the sub-postmasters had when dealing with the Horizon system, that they had no ability to interact with it beyond phoning up the support service and hoping that the software engineer knows what's going on. And we are now being able to exploit that, work with people to how these systems can help and support them, release quality attention, and reinvest human capital in more innovation. And that's the attention flywheel. And with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Neil, thank you so much. What a stimulating lecture. Let's unpack it. Please have a seat. So we'll come to the audience in a moment for some Q&A, but let me start with a couple of questions. I have so many questions, which will not include my aerial taxi. So the coin pushing idea is really interesting to me, this sense that if you are already on the edge, you are the sort of the next one off the edge, as it were. Do you see with AI that we are going to have a different category of left behind people? Who is the next category of the left behind that we need to plan for?
I don't know, but one of the things I have spent time... So I think it's always interesting to talk to taxi drivers about what other things they've done, because taxi drivers have a real diverse and interesting set of backgrounds. In fact, we had one in our Liverpool dialogue. And how they came... I remember once I was picked up in Lancaster, and the driver explained that he'd actually wanted to be a musician, and then all his bandmates went off to university. So he then went to catering college, and then he was like a cook in the Lancaster prison, which is the castle up there. And then I think he was specific that it was Kenneth Clark, I haven't verified this, that closed Lancaster prison. And then he ended up driving a taxi. And what's sort of so interesting about that is that, you know, not that driving a taxi is, you know, it's for a lot of people. I met a chartered accountant who was just between jobs and had emigrated to the UK and got a taxi license, then become a chartered accountant. And it was like, well, while I'm waiting for my next job, I'm just going to drive a taxi. You know, it's a really interesting, flexible task. And what's interesting about it is when we were, you know, there was all this hype about driverless cars back in 2015 with Elon Musk saying we'd have them by 2017, if I remember the quote. And so there was a lot of discussion about what that type of automation would do to those taxi drivers. And of course, none of that sort of panned out yet. But I think the lesson it taught me is, you know, whatever you sit there thinking with the numbers and whatever else, unless you're listening to people's actual stories about what they've been through and why, and then realize that this particular characteristic that if you haven't been supported in changing your role, that's when you're isolated. So fine, he'd left, I mean, he seemed perfectly happy driving, he enjoyed. But let's say the taxi wasn't there. What would this individual have done? Well, I don't know, but I would like there to be a world where there was like some sort of local AI club or some local capability or whatever else, where he could go and find out this stuff. And we used to try and provide this nationally, institutionally, but we've decided we couldn't do that anymore. And actually, I don't think we can even provide the quality of provision that we could provide if we were just encouraging people to help each other and supporting them in how to do that.
I mean, a question, I think it's related to that, about the speed and scale of change. So I think it's only probably last year, is it, that we had that public letter famously signed by Elon Musk calling for a moratorium on AI because we need to get a grip on this before it runs away from us. Is the nature of your approach to human need, does that mean we have to take account of the speed of development moving too fast in relation to us being able to calibrate it with human need? Is that something you're concerned about, we should be concerned about?
Absolutely, and I think that's the key of the crux of the problem. I mean, with regard to that, I have one tactic, which is if anything hits the news and it sounds like it might have been taken from chapter 1 in an Isaac Asimov novel, I just think that this is just going to disappear, as it all did. And everything that it has been of that nature, running around screaming about existential risk, summits about killer robots, is all dissipating, as you would expect. But it doesn't mean there's not a socio-technical existential risk. I firmly believe that we're seeing that. And that's much more pernicious and hard to deal with. And the only way you have is working out ways of the population being able to assimilate, absorb, and respond. So this type of investment in human capital, which, as I say, I'm not asking for like billions of pounds, it's about what we do as universities. I think that the right people to convene these things are universities, not through our undergraduate programs, but just through that we are a place that people can come together, different areas. And empowering people with the understanding they need to make their own choices, because they are expert in their own area. The public dialogues consistently show that. They consistently show that people are far wiser about this technology than the people who are often, well, than some of the published policy in Westminster. We have to be a bit careful. Some of it's very good. But the stuff that is good is founded in these dialogues and this sort of understanding. The stuff that is poor is the sort of knee-jerk response that we see to these issues that hit the headlines, which, do gain a lot of attention because, of course, they're sort of, they're very interesting narratives. They're taken from science fiction. That's why they're in Isaac Asimov novels. And not to mean that anything that's in an Isaac Asimov model couldn't happen, but they're over-selected for in the media, right? Science fiction stories are great. They're very interesting. So if they seem to be panning out in reality, they tend to be highly reported on. Which is why I tend to sort of pay less attention to those, because they're less likely to be reflective of the actual underlying problem. But I think I always do this terrible rambling thing. So to give a firm answer to your question, yes, this is happening fast. And the only way we can deal with it is to have everyone prepared. And I don't mean prepared as in like, they have to wait, just in terms of understanding what choices they have or who they can ask about their choices when they're worried. And in that, it seems like crazy, but this type of approach scales exponentially, right? If you can persuade the people who've benefited to do the same thing in their own companies, in their own institutions, for the local government association, for their local education trust, for whoever the group is, and do it in the right spirit with these ideas at the core, it scales very, very quickly.
Thank you. One more question from me, and then I'll come to the audience. So please have your questions ready. And if I can bring you in, Jess, on AI at CAM and whether what you are doing or striving to do is to model the approach that you think should then be duplicated in every place in the United Kingdom or in the world. AI at Doncaster, AI in Tasmania, where I'm from. We won't go into that. Or are you actually sort of thinking it will grow out from Cambridge? So it's a model that starts here and then goes out.
Yes, and Neil has set out this problem that we're facing of the supply of AI technologies we have not matching the demand or the public need. We're fundamentally trying to bridge between those two, so trying to connect Cambridge's AI capabilities to the issues or applications that we know people care about, recognizing that that's about working a problem. There isn't a single answer in this space. We can develop an approach, we can scale what works, but what we really want to do is to work to empower the people who are trying to improve our public services, who are trying to translate AI developments into public benefit, and to build an ecosystem of innovation around that we can then scale. We think that could work in other places, that's great, but we wouldn't pretend to be a single answer, because this isn't a single problem, this is a complex system where we need multiple points of intervention to shift towards a different model of innovation.
So you're modelling the process, essentially, that can be followed. Yeah.
And I think it's really, we don't want to own this, because by trying to own it, we just would restrict it. I think that there's some certain ideas that we'd like to share and people to understand and do this in their own ecosystems where they'll know what their own challenges are.
Thank you. We shall turn to the audience, the atomic humans out here, who I can, I shouldn't say things like that because then the hands go up. Let's start on the left-hand side, halfway up, just behind you, Christina, actually. Gentleman there. Yep.
Thanks. Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Now
yes.
we can. Thank you.
Hi, Neil. Thanks very much for that great talk. You were talking about humans having this inflation-resistant core. What's convinced you that we do indeed have an inflation-resistant core? Because it's not clear to me that that might be true. And you also mentioned it might be immeasurable. And is it immeasurable because it doesn't exist, maybe? I don't know what you think.
I think, well, you know, okay, so there's another argument, a transhumanism argument that says we just become some sort of non-human thing. A minority of people certainly think that at the moment, but they're dominating the conversation. And they're driving us towards some form of digital tyranny where that's going to be imposed on us, whether we like it or not. Absolutely. You go out and start imposing these technologies in the way people are claiming, you are removing all humanity. And you know, we can see this history, and I don't want to say that the boundaries of human decision-making won't change. Like, if you go back to Mesopotamia and you look at the Code of Hammurabi being introduced 1700 BC, it's the second code of law. Why do you need legal code? Well, you need legal code because people are now interacting with too many people in too larger ecosystems for them to be able to apply what would have been the previous moral labor in decisions and judgments about people in a smaller group. Does that use of a legal code make you less of a human? Well, arguably it's cutting into their atomic human core. Someone would have said at the time, no, these decisions all have to be made by the elders or by some group, right? Why do you make that decision? You make that decision because actually you have greater productivity, and as a result you get certain things cheaper, in this case grain, and in some sense people's standards of life improve, right? Okay, so you're sort of saying, well, you could take that all the way to the end, and then we could all decide to give up any sense of humanity at the heart of us. Well, number one, I don't think people will want that. Number two, I don't know whether they'll want that. Number three, it should be up to them to decide. And the only way of deciding that well is to ensure people are given the sort of skills they need to use the technologies as they see fit, rather than having the technologies imposed on them. So in some sense, I don't really, you know, whether the atomic human core exists, I wrote 400 pages claiming it does. But for the purpose of this argument and how you approach the problem, it's like, well, do you just want to sort of be subject to what a few very large companies, a small number of large companies think, or what governments think? Because this form of tyranny can also come from government. I mean, that's what the Stasi was about. Or do you believe in the system that operates in this country of a distributed social liberal democracy, wherever your sort of feeling is, where we have democratic institutions that reflect the desires of the people? And I go with the latter. That's the thing I'm trying to defend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, please. Yes, in the middle. Third row back here, Nina.
Hi, I'm Simona Schnall, Department of Psychology. So a lot of what you talked about, of course, has a lot of connections to psychology. And when you talk about ideas, what came to mind was how psychologists have defined creativity. And it's, of course, very difficult to define. And one way of trying to capture it is to say that first it has to be novel, of course, and second, but it still has to be appropriate to solve a problem. But even that makes it difficult to say what is creative and what isn't. So another way of categorizing it is to say that, well, get a bunch of experts in that domain who know what's creative and ask them if that specific thing is creative. So it's a bit of a circular definition, but at the same time, it works really well, right? So people who have that expertise will be able to say what's creative. And it does seem to me like what we need in that attention economy or that economy of ideas and so on is for people to be creative. So I was thinking of how you set up your talk, right? There is no AI that would take the idea of the philosopher's stone and how you turn tin into gold as an analogy of how AI takes certain cognitive skills, takes them over, or rather when AI takes up certain skills, they become, in a way, there's an inflation of the value of those ideas and so on. So basically, putting ideas together in a novel way is, in my opinion, a future-proof skill. And what I often think about is how can we teach that? So in a university context, how do we teach these kinds of things? So for all the students in the room, what should they be learning now? Instead of, let's say, writing the typical essays and exam papers and so on, which of course they'll still have to do for a little while. So I don't want to discourage that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And this point about going to other people to define it is kind of this notion in the attention economy that actually we empower other people to share that sort of progress. Because we don't know. And I think the problem that we face is this is a very, very disruptive technology. I mean, it's not artificial general intelligence, is not killer robots, but it's massively disruptive in terms of humans can talk to computers and ask them to do things for the first time. And I think what that means is, and this is actually why developing economies are so interesting, because established economies have done a division of labor, a separation of concerns. We're all doing different things. These people know, they teach. These other people do this, they teach. All bets are off on that. But it doesn't mean that you now start saying we throw away all our institutions, because actually the expectation that we produce a student with a certain set of capabilities will still be required in society. We can't suddenly abandon the way we educate. So the description of what I've laid out is an attempt to add a layer of communication and understanding, which will produce the next generation of people who do inform. So everything has to co-evolve, right? These ecosystems, as we move forward in education, legal systems, everything else, there have to just be these opportunities for communication of what's working from people who are doing these things at the front end to people who are doing things in other areas. I should say, actually, it was so Diane's book, Cogs and Monsters, I did a session on that with her. And she explained beautifully in that book how the point in, I mean, if I'm getting it wrong, Diane, apologies. But the point in market economics is it's a way of sharing information between people. This is what's important to me, I share this. It propagates information in a peer-to-peer way. But, the notion, I think, in Diane's book is, you get these economic monsters in these sort of large-scale information ecosystems. And that sort of fundamentally undermines the ability of that information to move. And I guess I'm taking that potentially a stage further and saying, well, actually, for the things we really care about, it may be that the information will never move properly amongst the financial ecosystem, and that we need to make sure we've got this layer of people choosing. The main currency we actually have is our time, and that we need to encourage people to show what they care about by sharing their time in a productive manner. But at the moment, most of these technologies are about consuming our time rather than allowing us to share it in a productive manner.
There's a cluster of discussions that started even before the latest wave of innovation with large language models about AI in education, which started from the point of saying, well, we should measure what machines can do. We can measure what people can do. And once the machines can outperform the people, we'll stop training them in those things and we'll move on to something else. And it's part of this kind of fundamental difference in looking at AI. So it's very much been a tech push approach to thinking about AI. So technology happens and we'll respond to it. And part of what we really need from the next wave of innovation and policy thinking is actually what type of future do we want to create? Because we know technology isn't something that just happens. It's shaped by people, by institutions, by processes. So actually we have an opportunity now to try again to put our social need or our social desires in the frame and organise the rest of our systems around that.
And I mean, if I can push you both then on what is the role of government in that? So should government just sort of be getting out of the way and pushing money out to find the innovators out there? Is that, or is government a conduit to this new future?
Are you looking at me first to go?
I can start. I'll start and Jess will clean it up. If Jess starts, then it's already fully expressed, so I don't have anything else to do. So one of the things, I think there's lots of things that government can do. But I think the challenge is that there's a desire, or certainly there was under the previous government, for understandable political reasons, to come in and say, we're leading in this space, which it involves grand gestures. Grand gestures are pretty difficult to do when you don't have any money in the bank. And you know, our grand gesture was to spend 100 million on an institute when every other country was spending hundreds of millions more, just in the process of things. So those things can be, I think they're important politically and they're going to be happening, but there's lots of things that government can do that don't cost that much money, or that we can do across government, and it's government, civil society, various other things. One of which, for example, so I was involved in the computer science research evaluation framework, which is, as people who are in academia will know, encourages us to think about impact. So we're all encouraged to do things that have impact and then write impact case studies that say what this impact was. But under that current system, when we were marking these impact case studies, if I was looking at a university that had done some work with their local government to do the type of thing that I'm just describing, facilitate and allow them to deploy more efficiently, that didn't make, it's not an impactful, actually, they didn't mind if the research wasn't on the cover of Nature, but they wanted the impact to be international. So you would get more reward under this mechanism of incentivization for you managed to build something that Apple incorporated in their product and shipped across the whole world and made billions out of. Brilliant, well done you. Even though none of that economic benefit came back to the UK, then if your staff had spent time with the local hospital or the local school or the local authority. It's a small thing, but it's a big thing, right? And actually that's, I've been advising regularly to UKRI, and actually that was the end of, we said that as a computer science panel, that's ridiculous. You have to look again at how you're defining impact and how you're incentivizing people to deliver impact, because you're basically getting people who are actually well positioned to interact with their local community. You're undermining the notion of a civic university, right? Because you're saying, well, you all have to compete for Nobel Prizes, right? They're not in a position to do that. That's a small one, but it's a big one. And there's lots of things like that. The misunderstanding of what a national institute should be, this continual creation of an institute that is going to be the one-stop shop for doing all the research in these spaces. Same errors being made again and again. Because what do academics do if you give them £100 million and say you're the one-stop shop? They become coconut scientists who pluck the ideas from their own head and keep offering you, well, actually you can do a lot with coconut, can't you? Maybe coconut's the wrong thing. You can do a lot with coconut. But what they should be doing is managing the supply chain of ideas. They should be saying, there's Marion Oswald up in Northumbria. She's really expert on this. We should get her in. That's their entire role should be that. Occasionally, if there's lots of questions that government are asking, then they should be capable of answering those small questions, what I think of as science as a service type questions. They should have that capability, right? And that should be in the civil service more widely. But this sort of misunderstanding about how information should flow is critical. So, it would be nice if, we've had two major national institutes now, and both of them, I think, are falling into the same trap of being the world-leading experts in a certain area, which utterly disincentivizes them to do what they should be doing, which is building on what I think of as Campus UK, the extraordinary capability we have across this country. So how are we addressing that? Well, the beautiful thing is, we're Cambridge, and, we are, almost by definition, considered prestigious and excellent. So if we start saying, this is what we should be doing, there's excellence in the rest of the country, and we take the notion of leadership to say that we show the way forward and enable others to follow, to your earlier question. I think that that's a very powerful response. And I think government can learn to do the same thing. Government has the same convening power. People are interested in helping. But there's just some slight errors in the way they're choosing to deploy it that actually create more politics and more division in the academic community.
One of the shifts we see when we look at the public dialogues we've run this year versus those in 2016 is that in 2016, people were coming to the table with sort of an open mind on regulation. So a sense that, yes, there would need to be some governance. We're not quite clear what that looks like. Fast forward, what we're seeing are much stronger calls for independent oversight to govern how technologies are developing. A sense from people that they can already see these technologies not serving their interests, and we need stronger interventions. So one of the first things government can try to do is to stop bad things from happening. To stop that, we need to build our regulatory capacity, and a starting point there would be understanding our current regulatory frameworks, the gaps between different regulators, the overlaps, and where we need to target scarce resources and attention to help build regulatory capacity. If we can get that right, we can also be thinking about how government can play a role in enabling the positive applications we want by acting as a convener for that national vision about areas of need in AI, by helping grow the domestic innovation base, both in research and in the commercial world, and in designing all of these huge investments we've seen in compute facilities, in research and so on, in ways that actually deliver for that wider community of users, in ways that deliver a genuinely open public innovation infrastructure.
Yeah, that point about regulators is absolutely vital. Going back for 10 years, we've asked government to, in preparation for this, to do a gaps and overlaps analysis, and it's never happened. And if you talk to regulators and talk to people who are being regulated, this is the main challenge they're facing. That actually they're often faced with regulators telling them conflicting things because no one's done the overlaps analysis. This is changing with the Digital Regulators Cooperation Forum and some things. But really, this has been something that we've known about for the best part of a decade.
Thank you. There is time for more questions. Claire in the front here.
Thank you. And thank you. I love this. And I think your kind of idea of this sort of much more bottom-up, demand-driven, decentralized approach to technology innovation is very inspiring and is a bit, as you were just kind of coming to, of a really helpful sort of middle ground between the exclusive focus on safety and the exclusive focus on technology is going to save us, which I think is really helpful. My question is, I suppose, something about sort of how we get from here to there. And the one big institution in this area that you haven't talked about so much is the big technology company, and kind of where they sit in this. So I'm just wondering, in this vision of sort of this much as the same or decentralized, demand-driven approach to technology innovation, what is it that we need those big companies to do differently or better or worse or not at all? And how can we make them do that?
No, there's a good question.
Government, big tech, we can fix it all this evening. You want to start this time?
Yeah, so Neil referred in his talk to our work with the Accelerate Programme for Scientific Discovery, which is an initiative aiming to advance the use of AI for science. And that's an area where we've seen big tech make fantastic advances. So we've seen these wonderful flagship initiatives like AlphaFold that have demonstrated or really been beacons for what's possible in this field and for enthusing a community about engaging. That's great. That is required or is built on decades of work in the research community to curate data resources, to build interdisciplinary collaborations, to grow a community that was there ready to take that challenge on. So we can see tech as a positive driving force in some of these areas. We just also need to be able to back that up with an appreciation of what has been delivered by the public infrastructure that has allowed that innovation to happen. And I think there are some interesting questions in the next phase of AI development about, well, what are the shared challenges or issues in that kind of pre-competitive environment where we could be working across big tech and small companies to actually drive a wider range of different types of AI adoption in a way that is kind of safe, trustworthy, and aligned with social interests.
And just to build on that, I mean, so I come out of a month where there was an AI for Science forum at the Royal Society that if you read any Google announcement on it, it was just a Google event. I was invited to Chatham House to hear James Manienka, who's extraordinary, but he's an SVP of Google, and the event was sponsored by Google. And then I see today that, a very great sounding AI hub in Camden is being sponsored by Google and has the Prime Minister there launching it. So the mind share that these companies have is you just can't compete. And the challenge we sort of have is the people who work at these companies, although they come from the ecosystem that Jess is talking about, they don't seem to remember that when they're talking to government. And they seem to have almost, at the moment, it feels like a lock on government thinking. More so, in my impression, with this government than the previous, actually. Which I think is part of, the natural, this government feeling it needs to be seen as business friendly. But they haven't understood, and sometimes the previous government didn't seem to fully understand their own policy. Pro-innovation is not being big tech friendly. Pro-innovation is creating an environment, as Jess was saying, where small players supporting the type of work that we see in the, my favorite bill, that this is the one room in the country where there's several people that know, and I always get it right, the Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Act, which was rendered into law, as we all know, on the 24th of May, gained royal assent just before the election, and got through by the skin of its teeth. One of the most important pieces of legislation in this space to start to rebalance the centralization of power that comes with these powerful information networks and redefine what we think of as markets. So that's going to start, and there are similar acts in Europe, and well, up until recently, the US seemed to be thinking in different ways. We'll see what happens with the US. But I think there's a change in the underlying legal regulatory landscape that has accepted that this is a problem. I think that there's a lot of momentum because, as Jess says, that these are extraordinary achievements that have been funded by these companies. But I think that the only response, I definitely think we should be working with them and collaborating with them. We need to sort of raise the voices of the other communities. But the best route to do that is to do stuff. The problem I think you end up with is, everyone's standing off that going, oh, you're not doing this right, you're not doing that right, but then everyone says, but you're not doing anything, right? You actually have to come in with some alternative ideas and alternative model. And we're starting to see, or what I'm starting to hope that we're seeing is that there is a sort of model that works, that we can build on. And then once we have that, I think big tech will line up behind it as well. I don't think that they're somehow inherently evil. I just think that the wheels have come off the ecosystem somewhat, and that we need to get them back on. And it's in their interests, along with everyone else's, to sort of have a well-regulated, liberal democratic society.
Thank you. There was a question at the... Ellie, is that you? I can't hear.
Thank you. So in your public opinion research that you undertook in 2017 and 2014, if I remember, on public opinions on machine learning, one of the common threads was people noting that they wanted humans to still be at the center of these processes, and that AI was a co-pilot and shouldn't replace doctors, et cetera. And I'm wondering if you think this more so reflects anxieties about the model's capabilities to succeed or fail. That is, do you think that thread sort of reflects people are worried about replacement by machines, or they've seen these machines fail too many times, or they're worried about the quality of the work that they'll produce. And if you think the former, or the latter, as these machines become smarter and more capable, do you think you'll see a diminished amount of people in these public opinion researchers wanting humans to still be at the center of those processes?
So I think there were two threads feeding into that conclusion. One was, could any AI system possibly have everything it needs, or all the different factors or data types that should go into making a decision about me? There's confidence that the systems could have enough data to accurately diagnose something, but is it going to see how I'm reacting in the room and understand what that might mean, either for how I've presented my symptoms to you, or how I would take a diagnosis? There's that sense of really needing that personal interaction in order to capture the full range of inputs you'd need to be able to make an effective decision. The second strand was around that personal interaction, that even if there was an AI that could perfectly precisely diagnose you, you need that human interaction, that conversation, that sense of shared humanity in situations where you're talking about something that could have a deeply personal impact on you or your loved ones.
And I think just to build on that, I don't know where these feelings necessarily come from. I think they differ for different people. I was presenting the book in Utah, and of course it's a very religious culture, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is omnipresent. And when I asked people about what the atomic human was, the first answer I got was, it's my relationship with God. And although I'm not religious, I think that's a fantastic answer, because that's something that's personal to them, and it's about how they and their community are trying to lift themselves to achieve greater things. So I'm sort of almost less concerned about the why, because it sort of feels like it's not up to me. There's been too much of us sitting around and sort of deciding what people need and what people want, and that doesn't seem to have worked. I didn't sort of say it in the talk, but an extrapolation of the problems I'm talking about is what's leading to populism. People being told that this is what they wanted. And I think one of the things I was most depressed about with this Future of Europe meeting is that it was mostly populated by people from the sort of centre-left, and they weren't giving any new answers. It's like their answer was, people are wrong. That's not an answer. And so I think we have to be very careful, because I think as academics, and I'm not sure where I am, I asked Claude about the book and tried to find out where I was politically. It told me I was a democratic institutionalist with some conservative and some liberal views. And so that must be right. But within the thing I sort of believe there is we've done, I think it's a good analysis that Jess gave, but perhaps the real thing is we shouldn't be trying to second guess why people feel that. We should be allowing them to have that opinion and to express that opinion, and allow that opinion to evolve as they become more used to the technology and steer things in the direction they want. Now, that's some sort of utopia if we're doing that all the time, but we're not doing that at all.
My friends, I know there are lots of questions still in the room. Unfortunately, we have arrived at 7 o'clock, and I suspect the conversation on AI has got a few more hours, days and years to go. So at this moment, can I ask you all to join me in thanking Neil and Jess for such a great evening.